Hello, my name is Dr. Luke Bell. I'm lecturer in molecular horticulture at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. This is a screencast of material originally made available for the module Principles of Horticulture and Crop Production from the years 2020 to 2025. Please note that some of the details may now be outdated.
Learning outcomes are to describe the origins of beetroot and chard and their relationship with wild relatives, describe the appearance of beetroots and the variation present within modern cultivars, explain the optimum cultivation conditions for beetroot crops, give an example of nutrient deficiency and the symptoms of this in beetroot roots, and give examples of different Swiss chard cultivars. So beetroot, also known just as beet, and chard, also known as Swiss chard, they're both members of the same species called Beta vulgaris. So they're both related to spinach and are part of the Amaranthaceae family of plants. So beetroot is a very ancient crop which has been cultivated for at least 4,000 years. It was likely domesticated in the Mediterranean region and was initially grown in ancient Babylonia as far back as the 8th century BC. It's also introduced later on into parts of China in the 9th century CE. Beetroot was originally grown for its leaves, similar to how spinach is now cultivated, but actually fell out of favour for cultivation of its leaves because of the rise in popularity of spinach. So after that, it started to be consumed for its roots. Chard is a much more recent crop, with the earliest mentions of it in literature in the 13th century. So colonists introduced beetroot and chard to the Americas in the later centuries, the 16th and 17th centuries. And by the time of the 19th century, many different cultivars and colour variants of both chard and beetroot were being grown in the USA. Beetroot and chard are members of the same species as sugar beet, which is an economically important agricultural crop, and also fodder beet, which is also known as mangelwurzel. And that's shown here in this slide. So it's harvested again for its fleshy roots, which are typically used as animal feed, as the name suggests. And then there's also sea beet, which is, I guess, the kind of wild relative of beetroot and other types of beets. So sea beet is known as Beta vulgaris subspecies maritima. So it's actually a salt-tolerant halophyte crop and species, and also crops such as beetroot and chard and spinach are also have that property. So they're quite resistant to saline conditions. They're closely related also to and are part of the same family as quinoa and orach as well, which are cultivated for their grains and leaves. So the subspecies vulgaris of Beta vulgaris can be further subdivided into three kind of groups which are of relevance to horticulture. So there's the sickler group, which is called spinach beet. That's not to be confused with spinach, which is a different species. So this is a Beta vulgaris, which is harvested for its leaves, and the name kind of comes from the similarity of those leaves to spinach, but it is a type of beet. Then they have the flavescens group, which is where Swiss chard belongs to, and the conditiva group, which is beetroots. So beetroot is a cool season frost tolerant crop. Its leaves form a rosette kind of structure, and the plant, as the plant matures, a taproot develops. So it takes on this kind of bulbous structure, and then the kind of taproot grows down deep into the soil. Beetroot leaves can be light green or to dark red in colour, and you can actually also eat the leaves as well. That's not commonly done commercially, but home growers might also consume the leaves of beetroot plants. Leaf shapes and textures are highly variable and kind of similar in appearance to chard leaves. Typically they're elongated and can be quite triangular in shape, as I think you can see in this slide here, and the texture of those can be either wrinkled or smooth. The root forms close to the surface and narrows as depth increases, so it can be quite spherical at the surface, which then quickly narrows into a very thin taproot. The harvested roots are typically have a smooth skin. Different cultivars, the texture of the skin is smoother than others. Wild relatives of beetroot actually have a white skin and white flesh, but human breeding efforts have created the kind of distinctive red and purple beetroot cultivars that we kind of know today. But beetroots can be an array of different colours, as you can see in this slide. So the flesh of the roots can sometimes even be striped on the inside, so you have this kind of alternating banding pattern. So red and purple cultivars are coloured that way because they have high concentrations of compounds called beta-cyanins. The yellow beetroots, as you can see in the bottom left of this slide, so those have a higher amount of compounds called beta-xanthins, and so the ratio between beta-cyanins and beta-xanthins kind of gives the different shadings and different colours of the roots. And the white roots, they're kind of more typical of a wild type of beetroot, which lacks the beta-cyanin and beta-xanthin pigments. Beetroot is the most common. Red beetroot is the most common commercial type of beetroot grown. Crops can develop rapidly in about 50 to 80 days from direct seeding, and both open pollinated and F1 hybrid varieties are common commercially. One particularly common cultivar type is often referred to as the Crosby Egyptian type. So this is characterized by its red and purple internal rings, which you can see in this slide, and early maturing kind of spherical, very round roots. It's typically used for the fresh market and also for pickling. Next we have the Detroit Dark Red. Is a late maturing cultivar type. It has a more oval shaped root and a very prominent kind of pointed taproot, which you can again see at the bottom of this slide. The interior flesh tends to be a solid red colour, so it lacks that kind of internal banding as we saw in the previous slide, and it's typically used for the slicing market. Next we have Golden Beet, which has this distinctive golden yellow colour, as I mentioned, which is created by beta-xanthins in the flesh. It's not commonly grown commercially, but it's popular with home gardeners and people who own allotments. The roots tend to be less sweet than red types and red and purple types, but it also has a less powerful earthy flavour. Next we have quite a striking beetroot cultivar. It's called Chioggia, and this is an heirloom variety, so it's not typically produced commercially, but may be grown by amateur growers. It's named after a small town near Venice in Italy, and it has this distinctive red and white striped flesh on the inside of the roots. This striping is kind of very attractive when it's harvested and the root is raw. However, after cooking, this kind of dissipates and fades. In terms of beetroot production, as I mentioned before, beetroots are frost tolerant and can withstand temperatures as low as about -9 degrees. Optimum yields are achieved in regions with low night temperatures, and the kind of optimum temperature range is between about 12 to 24 degrees centigrade. Beetroots are tolerant to high temperatures but can't withstand that for long, particularly without additional irrigation, as I'll mention in a moment. So the soils in which beetroots are grown should be porous and well drained for optimum yields. The soil should also be free of stones and clods, as these can kind of interfere with a uniform root formation. So the soil should typically be rotivated prior to planting. Fresh market beetroot crops are spaced in rows about 38 to 50 centimeters apart and have very close in-row spacing, which may be thinned out according to the market requirements. Spacing is generally closer for beetroots which are used in the processing market, as they're typically harvested earlier and therefore much smaller. If beetroots grow too large and too quickly, they can be susceptible to cracking, which would make a crop unsaleable. In terms of fertilizer and nutrition, beetroots are, as I mentioned, tolerant to salinity, but they are quite sensitive to acidity. So they have quite a narrow optimum range for soil pH between about 6.4 and 6.8. Nitrogen is the most limiting nutrient and required in moderate amounts for a crop. And some soils may need additional phosphorus, potassium and sulfur applications too. Boron and zinc are also required for optimal growth, and boron in particular can result in a deficiency of boron can result in what's a disease or a disorder called cavity spot. So this is black discolorations on the inside of the root flesh. And again, it may not be apparent until the crop is harvested as to whether this has occurred. The condition can also lead to a condition called heart rot. So it's similar in a lot of ways to boron deficiencies in brassicas, for example. So a good supply of boron is required for optimal growth, around about 600 grams per hectare. In terms of irrigation, beetroots, while they have quite a penetrating tap root, their root systems are actually still quite close to the surface of the soil compared to a lot of other crops. So they must have a continuous water supply available to them in well-drained soils. Early crops can be rain-fed, but in summer, particularly if the temperature is increasing and transpiration rates increase, they may need constant irrigation. Overhead irrigation is common, but micro irrigation, as I've mentioned before in previous screencasts, is much more efficient at delivering the right amounts of water to the soil surface. And the plants need approximately 2.5 centimeters of water per week. In terms of harvesting, beetroots can be harvested by hand, but it is more common for machines to do this now. Post-harvest, the roots must be cooled quite quickly in order to preserve their shelf life in the fresh market. So if they are for the fresh market, they should be stored at around about 0 degrees C or as close to 0 as possible. And the shelf life is generally between 10 to 15 days. Many beetroot crops, however, are intended for the processing and pickling markets, so therefore those can have a much longer shelf life if they're pickled in vinegar, for example. And finally, I'm just going to move on to talking a little bit about Swiss chard. So the cultivation requirements are quite similar to beetroot, so I won't go over those again for this particular crop. But the crop is produced for its characteristic leaves, which are broad and crisp and have this very colourful stems. Swiss chard is more tolerant to hot weather than beetroot, but there are relatively few cultivars of chard which have been developed. They can have either smooth or wrinkled leaves. As you can kind of make out in this slide, they're mostly kind of wrinkled. Chards, as I say, are available in a wide range of colours and are often cultivated for this purpose, for how they look. Sometimes, because of the colour of the stems, they can be mistaken for rhubarb, but rhubarb is a completely different species and unrelated to chard. So I'll just go through a few examples of some quite common and characteristic Swiss chard cultivars. So this one is one called Ford Hook Giant, and there's also a similar one called White Silver, and so it's so named because of these distinctive white stems. So instead of having bright coloration in the stems, it has this kind of very white veining and patterning on the leaves and on the stems. Then we have a cultivar called Bright Lights, which is known as a type of rainbow chard. So these are typically open pollinated varieties which produce stems of varying from red to pink, yellow and orange. And then finally we have a cultivar called Ruby Red, and it has this distinctive bright red stem and veining patterning, and the leaves kind of have this almost Savoy type appearance, similar to a kind of kale or cabbage leaf, and so this one is quite popular. So in summary, beetroot and chard are members of the same species, Beta vulgaris. Beetroots are grown for their roots, which have a range of shapes and colours. Beetroot is a frost and salt tolerant crop, but requires additional nitrogen and boron fertilisation and consistent irrigation in the summer months. Beetroot has a short fresh market shelf life, but roots can be preserved for longer periods by pickling. And Swiss chard cultivars are diverse in texture and colour and are popular with home gardeners.